Hello and welcome to today's webinar, How Local Authorities Can Assure a Credible Sustainability Strategy. My name is April Rose. I'm the Marketing Manager for Sustainability at BSI. Before we start, there are a few housekeeping points to go through. Firstly, you have joined a muted webinar, so you should be able to hear us all clearly. This is a recorded webinar and you will receive a copy of this recording via email. If you want to ask a question during today's session, you can do so by typing into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. This will then go to our speakers, and we will try to answer as many of these as we can in our Q&A session at the end. If you can't hear us or have any other issues, please also type into the questions box and we'll advise you as best we can. So I'd like to go through today's agenda, which will feature an introduction to BSI, how standards can support a credible sustainability strategy, and our guest speakers discussing ISO 14001, Will It Help?, before a Q&A with our audience. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our four speakers: Vicky Mercer, Sustainability Commercial Manager at BSI, Laurie Wood, UK and Ireland Sustainability Sector Lead at BSI, Dr. Steve Simmons, Strategic Environmental Advisor at Warwickshire County Council, and Andrew Cooling, Government Development Lead at BSI. So firstly, Vicky, over to you.
Thank you, April. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining the webinar this morning. I hope you find it valuable. I'm going to start with a quick introduction on BSI. Hopefully, many of you have heard of BSI, are familiar with what we do, and will work with us in some capacity. However, I will share with you some insights into BSI that is hopefully new information to everybody on the webinar today. So BSI is the world's first national standards body. We were founded in 1901, and we are also a founding member of ISO, the International Standards Organization. We operate under a royal charter. This means that BSI does not have any shareholders, we are not government funded, and profits are reinvested back into the business for the future development of standards and guidance to further support organisations. We are also considered thought leaders and have shaped over 80,000 best practice standards and guidelines. Many of the standards that we will touch on today were initially created by BSI as British standards and then went on to be adopted by ISO, becoming internationally recognised standards. Next slide, please. So BSI is probably best known for the BSI kite mark or mark of trust, which is the logo that's displayed on the screen currently. A huge number of products and organisations globally are assessed by BSI in some capacity, and therefore will have license to display this logo as a sign of assurance. If you've ever looked closely at a manhole cover, a door handle, for example, quite often you will find our kite mark is present on there. And it's a mark of quality and to verify that BSI has tested these products or organisations to a certain standard. So to give you an idea of the scale of BSI, we deliver 50,000 audit days a year in the UK and around 300,000 globally. We service 83% of the FTSE 100, 53% of the Fortune 500, and have a total of 81,000 clients in 90 countries. In terms of our auditors, in the UK alone, we have 300 directly employed auditors and over 100 contracted auditors. And the image on the right-hand side actually shows the locations of our UK auditing team. So we've got a very wide geographical reach across the nation as well as globally. Next slide, please. In 2008, the Climate Change Act was agreed, which requires the UK to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 100% compared to 1990 levels. And I'm sure that many on the webinar will agree that local authorities are under increasing pressure to deliver on these net zero targets and demonstrate sustainability initiatives and credible carbon reduction plans. Buildings, surface transport and waste together account for 40% of UK greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore local authorities have significant scope to impact on these. A total of 120 councils have declared a climate emergency, and of these 73 have set net zero targets. However, policies must be enacted to bring out real change. So how do standards fit into this? Local authorities are looking at standards as a mechanism to help guide and create actionable plans for their environmental, energy and/or net zero objectives. Following the standard not only supports local authorities to achieve these targets, but also to prove to stakeholders, which often include their citizens as well, to showcase their journey and embed a robust sustainability strategy. Next slide, please. I'm now going to hand over to Laurie Wood, who is going to go into the detail of these standards further.
Thanks, April. Good morning, everybody. I'm Laurie. I'm the sector lead for sustainability for UK and Ireland for BSI. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about what a standard is, how standards can be used to implement a management system, and some of the key standards for organisations looking to become more sustainable. And also I'm going to touch on the benefits of third-party certification. Next slide. So I suppose the first question is, what is a standard? The Cambridge English Dictionary defines a standard as being a pattern or a model that is generally accepted, and also a level of quality. There's another definition of the word standard, which is a breed of dog of the usual type or size, but unfortunately for all the dog lovers out there, I'm going to be focusing on the first two definitions for the purposes of this presentation. Standards come in lots of different forms. You've probably heard of ISO standards, which are globally applicable standards, but there are also standards which are specific to individual countries. In the UK, these are British standards, but can also include publicly available specifications, which are PAS documents. You may have heard of PAS 2060, which is a specification for carbon neutrality, which I'll be talking about later on. You can see the BSI mark of trust on some eggs. We've recently done some work with Morrison Supermarket, who have, through implementing lots of clever processes and activities, they now have some carbon neutral eggs, which BSI have verified as truly carbon neutral, which means that they're allowed to use the BSI mark of trust on their products. Next slide, please. So standards can be applied to whole organisations or to individual parts or departments within an organisation. The approach is we take a risk-based approach to the application of standards. So most organisations will look at where their biggest risks are, where their biggest impacts are, and use the appropriate standard and the appropriate management system to address these key risks. Next slide, please. So as I said, standards require a risk-based approach, so organisations can focus on the most significant impacts and areas where the biggest improvements can be achieved. Since 2015, all standards have had the same higher level structure. This reduces duplication for organisations and supports the creation of integrated management systems which comply with multiple standards. For example, an integrated quality, environmental and health and safety management system. It's quite commonly adopted these days. In 2021, ISO approved the London Declaration, which means that all new and revised standards must include consideration of climate change. And for example, ISO 27001, which is a standard for information security, that now includes a requirement that organisations using this standard consider the risks and opportunities due to climate change and how that impacts on their management system. Next slide, please. Every management system standard is broken down into a series of clauses which set out the requirements for the headline areas that you can see on the slide. So leadership is critical to the successful implementation of a management system. Top management must support the development of policies, objectives, and provide sufficient resources for the effective implementation of the management system. Planning clauses include the identification of risks, opportunities, and how these impact on interested parties. They also cover setting objectives and implementing action plans for improvement. Obviously, management systems can't operate without support and resources. These include training, ensuring staff competence, and also ensuring effective communication within the organisation, but also externally when dealing with interested parties. The core of most management systems is the operational control section. This includes the planning and control of key processes for the organisation, and also includes emergency situations within the ISO 14000 standard, where organisations need to identify potential emergency situations which could impact on the environment and put controls in place to try and stop them happening. And if unfortunately they do happen, they have processes in place to minimise the environmental impact. The performance evaluation clauses cover the monitoring and measurement of key activities, and also monitoring the effectiveness of the management system itself through internal audits and management reviews. And then the final section, improvement. This focuses on corrective action and also continual improvement of the management system itself and the performance of the organisation overall. Next slide, please. So there are lots of different standards, and often a question we're asked is which standards are appropriate for an organisation. Although they are generally created to focus on specific topics, there are areas of overlap where they impact on several different areas, and you can see quite a lot of benefits through implementing a standard which you might not consider. For example, the ISO 9000 standard. So this is a standard for quality management. It can really help with the transition to net zero and improvements in efficiency through helping reduce waste and in increasing logistics efficiency. It has a quality impact, but also a significant environmental impact. And ISO 14000, traditionally, this is a standard for focusing on environmental impact. It can also improve health and safety performance due to companies and organisations implementing better controls over the use and disposal of hazardous materials. Next slide, please. So standards provide a clear structure to support the implementation of a management system. In order to gain most benefit from using standards, many organisations also seek formal certification for an organisation such as BSI. Third-party certification gives stakeholders confidence that you are working to a formal management system, and you are subject to ongoing audits to ensure that the system is being maintained and improved. Next slide, please. So there's lots of different standards out there. As April mentioned, BSI developed over 80,000 standards and best practice guidance over the years. So I'm just going to focus on 4 standards and also the BSI Net Zero Pathway. It's a framework which draws on some of the standards mentioned above, but it isn't a specific standard. Next slide, please. So ISO 14000 is probably the widest known sustainability standard. Many people think that environmental management is a fairly new concept, but the first standard for environmental management, BS 7750, was created by BSI in 1992. In 1996, this standard was adopted by ISO and became ISO 14001. Globally, more than 500,000 companies are certified to ISO 14001, and nearly 20,000 companies in the UK are certified to 14001. So it is quite a widely adopted standard. The standard's been revised twice, once in 2004 and more recently in 2015, where it was aligned with ISO 9000 and other management system standards under the higher level structure. 14000 has a number of benefits. It can help with legal compliance. There are many organisations who simply aren't aware of some of the environmental regulations that are out there, and it obviously puts them at risk because if, unfortunately, ignorance of regulations and requirements is no defence, and the environmental regulators are taking quite a strict line, particularly where organisations are not complying with waste-related legislation. There's also potential for cost savings through improved energy efficiency, reductions in waste, and better management of water. 14000 takes a risk-based approach, which means that organisations focus on the most significant environmental impacts and also the areas where there is the largest potential for improvement. It helps establish clear policies and procedures to improve control of day-to-day activities. Next slide, please. So the next slide I want to talk about, or the next standard, sorry, I want to talk about is 50001. Once again, this standard started out as a British standard, which was BS 16001, and this was issued in 2009 before it became adopted by ISO in 2011. It's very similar in structure to ISO 14000, but it has a real laser focus on energy consumption. It supports organisations to identify significant energy uses, to implement improved monitoring, and also to set objectives and actions to reduce consumption overall. I'm sure you'll be fully aware that energy prices have been all over the place over the last few years. A couple of months ago, I was with a large paper manufacturer, so very energy intensive process. And at one point, their gas price increased by 900%. It's a huge cost to any type of organisation. Anything that companies can do or organisations can do to reduce energy consumption is obviously going to have a financial payback. 50001 is also a useful tool to support carbon reduction plans as organisations move towards net zero. Next slide, please. So 14,000 and 50,001 are management system standards. I'm going to talk about 14064 now. This is a slightly different standard. It's a framework for organisations who want to calculate their organisational carbon footprint. So 14064 includes all scopes of emissions. So scope 1 are the relatively easy to address emissions. These are the direct emissions that are controlled by the organisation. For example, gas used in a boiler or fuel used in company vehicles. Scope 2 generally is electricity. It also covers imported heating and cooling. So if an organisation is responsible for managing district heating or district cooling, that comes under scope 2. And then scope 3, and this is really the sort of the complicated part. Scope 3 is everything else really. So it's CO2 emissions due to production of raw materials, commuting, and if you are making a product or designing a product, you need to consider the potential emissions due to the manufacture and use of that product. Depending on the type of organisation, scope 3s can be significant. For BSI, our scope 3 emissions are over 80% of our total carbon footprint. One of the drivers for certification or verification rather against 14064 is it helps you establish an accurate and credible baseline. It can help give credibility and avoid accusations of greenwashing. And just a quote from Peter Drucker, who is sort of a quality consultant and quite a big name within BSI. But he famously said, "You can't improve what you don't measure." And organisations are often setting themselves objectives and targets without really understanding what the carbon footprint actually is. And this can lead to situations where targets are not really hard enough, not challenging enough. And as we start to get towards 2030 and 2050, organisations are suddenly realising that they've got an awful lot to do because they didn't, and they underestimated what their original carbon footprint was. Next slide, please. So PAS 2060 and 14068. So these two standards are intended to support organisations who are looking to become carbon neutral on their route to becoming truly net zero. So PAS 2060 was launched in 2012 and is actually due to be withdrawn next year because it has been upgraded to an ISO standard 14068. So both standards include the calculation of a carbon footprint, but also an implementation of a carbon reduction plan, and then the use of carbon offset credits to balance out emissions. So drivers for verification against these two standards, again, similar to 14064, it's about establishing an accurate and credible baseline. It's also about validation of carbon reduction plans and confirmation that where carbon offset credits are being used, that they are actually delivering what they should be achieving. You may have seen some negative stuff in the press recently about carbon offset credits, where it's a bit of a Wild West situation at the moment, and there are some carbon credits out there which aren't delivering a reduction in emissions, and in some cases are actually increasing emissions. So PAS 2060 and 14068 require the use of what's called good quality or high quality carbon offset credits, which will actually deliver a reduction in atmospheric carbon. Next slide, please. And the final thing that I'm going to talk about is the BSI net zero pathway. So this isn't a standard, this is a scheme that BSI have created, which links a verified carbon footprint under 14064, which is UCAS accredited, so it gives a credible carbon footprint. And then also an audit of an organisation's carbon reduction plan using the principles in the ISO net zero guidelines. It's a document IWA 42. If you're interested, that document can be downloaded for free from the ISO website. It's not a requirement standard. It's not something an organisation can become certified against at the moment, but it does list the absolute gold standard, best practice and key principles for organisations who are embarking on a journey to net zero. So those are all the things that I want to talk about. So I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Steve Simmons, Strategic Environmental Advisor for Warwickshire County Council. Warwickshire Council have been clients of BSI's for over 30 years for ISO 9000 for their engineering and highways function, and for 18 years for ISO 14001. Earlier in 2024, they recontracted with BSI for a further 3-year certification cycle for 14001, and Steve's going to discuss some of the benefits they see from certification to ISO 14001. Over to you, Steve.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, so I'm Steve Simmons, I'm Strategic Environmental Advisor. I'm joined by my colleague today, Javier Garcia, who's our team lead. He'll be joining in for the questions, but I'll do the main bit of the talking. Can I have the next slide, please? For those of you who are not familiar with Warwickshire, we're right in the middle of England. We wrap around parts of the West Midlands. We cover areas of former mining areas up in the north, down to the beautiful Stratford on Avon countryside down in the south. So we're a fairly mixed authority. We're an upper tier authority, but we also include fire and rescue services in our portfolio. A few stats there. We've got about 4,500 staff contractors working, so we're a fairly large employer in the area. Next slide, please. In 2019, like many of the other authorities listed at the beginning, we declared a climate emergency, and we were then rudely interrupted by COVID, and it took us until 2023 to develop the mechanism for implementing that commitment to resolve the climate change emergency, and that was our Sustainable Future Strategy, which sets out our goal of being a net zero council by 2030 and supporting Warwickshire as a county as a whole to become net zero by 2050 or earlier if that's achievable. Next slide, please. Yes, we first gained registration to 14001 way back in 2006, and that initial registration was for the whole of the authority, everything the authority did, lock, stock and barrel. In 2017, we transitioned over to the new standard 2015 version, and that required a fairly major rejig of the standard, of our management system, but that was successfully certified. And in 2024, as has been mentioned, we re-tendered our certification against a slightly revised scope. With the cost pressures that ourselves and many local authorities are under at the moment, we needed to show some savings. So we honed in on the areas that we now understood to be the greatest risk. And there were some areas of the council which we could exclude because the risks that are inherent in their activities are low. So in 2024, the scope was, as stated on the slide there, it's our communities and resources directorates and wholly owned companies in relation to the built and natural resources of Warwickshire. We have several wholly owned companies. We have a legal services company. We manage various business centres under their separate companies, but the one that we've actually included within the scope at the moment is a trading company called Educators Limited that provide food services, meal services to schools in and around Warwickshire, but also to other external clients as well. Next slide, please. Right, so what do we get out of 14001? There's a cost involved, obviously, with certification and running the management system. What is the payback? Well, 14001 is a very robust framework. It allows you to plan, do, check, and act to ensure that you're targeting your efforts to achieving maximum output. Secondly, it helps us to ensure that we've identified environmental risks and we've put in place appropriate control measures. We also gain an understanding of legal and other compliance requirements, which are mapped against all of those risks. And that high-level overview that we have of the organisation as a whole makes sure that we're not missing any tricks, that we're identifying the right things and we're putting the appropriate amount of effort in to making sure that we don't cause pollution and that we comply. It's useful for tracking and reporting improvements in environmental performance, and obviously with what the focus of today's session is all about, being able to demonstrate that you're tackling the right issues and that you're moving forward is important. Independent certification is not an absolute. You can work to 14001, anyone can buy a copy of it and work to it, but independent certification from an external certification body, we use BSI, gives credibility of the information that we're putting forward into the domain of our key stakeholders. That's EA, residents, suppliers, customers, and even regulators. We have quite a few environmental permits that we operate to, and being able to say that our management system is certified gets a lot of credibility with external stakeholders. And finally, there are opportunities to align the environmental management system to other standards, and 50001 has been mentioned already, and that is something that we are looking at the moment. We haven't made a commitment, definitely, but we are certainly looking to try and add value to the fairly robust and mature management system that we've set up. Final slide, please. So what are our next steps? We have obviously a council delivery plan, which looks at strategically how we're going to move forward and deliver all of our statutory and non-statutory obligations, and trying to get the maximum value out of those. Aligning it with our principles set out in our management system is important, particularly when it comes to our sustainability and net zero strategies. Incorporating the requirements of 50001, which is the energy management standard, alongside our EMS is quite important, because clearly there's a lot of pressure on us to demonstrate delivery against the 2030 target, and having that robustness of the plan, do, check, act principles embedded right from the word go is important. As I've said previously, we haven't entered into a commitment to actually get external certification yet, but we might well move in that direction if there's a clear business case that we can establish. Finally, fully integrating our environmental management system to support our property strategy and the wider public estate is important. A lot of the environmental risks that we're managing have clear links to our property portfolio, 600 odd premises around the council. And we need to make sure that our own property and sharing assets through the public estate, that we try and put our efforts in to deliver greatest returns. And certainly our management system and 14001 certification is helping a lot there. Final slide. So that's a quick overview of Warwickshire's experience with 14,001. Myself and my colleague Javier will take questions at the end if that's appropriate. Back to you, Andrew.
So thank you very much, Steve. Great presentation. I certainly have a couple of questions myself, and just a reminder for those of you on the webinar to post any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll come to those at the end of the webinar. So by way of quick introduction, I'm Andrew Cooling, Government Development Lead at BSI. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to preview our training portfolio that falls under the sustainability banner. You can see the types of standards that we cover in terms of sustainability on the screen here. And of course, if you're thinking about implementing and auditing 14,001 and 50,001, we have a fairly significant training portfolio that will help you. And just to draw attention to some of the other courses that we have as well around sustainable events, which is ISO 2000121, and as mentioned previously, carbon neutrality PAS 2060. Okay. I would also want to take the opportunity to highlight a new career pathway that BSI have introduced. You can see from the diagram on the screen there, that's effectively splits into two pathways, starting with a kind of a requirements understanding. But then on the left-hand side, if you're interested in implementing either 14,001 or 50,001, or indeed both, you can see the kind of career pathway and the steps taken to becoming a qualified professional in terms of implementation, but also auditing as well. The auditing pathway is there on the right hand side. Okay. Finally, in terms of some of the more specialized courses the BSI Training Academy can offer, I just wanted to highlight a couple here. One that's very recently released and is certainly getting quite a lot of interest at the moment is around water efficiency management systems awareness, which is ISO 46001. A reminder, a lot of these courses are available as on-demand e-learning. Yeah, you can see for yourself some of the additional, more specialised courses that kind of fall under the sustainability or fall under the sustainability portfolio. Okay, so before we go to Q&A, I just wanted to hand back to Vicky, who will give a bit of an overview in terms of how you go about finding out more.
Thank you, Andrew. So if anybody would like to discuss any of the topics that we've covered today in more detail with me, or they've got any further questions that they wanted to ask outside of this webinar, please do reach out to me. My details are on the right-hand side, and I'm very happy to support with that. You can also scan the QR code on the screen, which books a Teams call in with me. So please do that if you'd like to explore any of these topics further. We've also provided some further material which you can download using the links on the screen. So we have a guide to progressing with standards. It's a very useful document covering in more detail many of the standards that we've discussed today, among others. We've got our Net Zero Barometer report, which is a white paper and gives some really interesting insights on the net zero landscape today. And then finally, we've got a link to the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, or the IWA 42. It's a free document, and it provides the best practices and guiding principles for organisations to consider when developing a transition plan for net zero. So please do reach out or download any of those documents for further information. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Vicky. Back to you, April, I think.
Thank you. Yes, I'm now going to hand over for some questions from our audience. So our first question is, what are the most challenging parts of implementing ISO 14001?
Shall I pick that up?
Yes, please, Steve.
Yeah. Well, we're obviously a very, very diverse organisation. We manage care homes, we cover fire and rescue, we do highways works, we've got waste sites. So there's a vast array of different types of environmental risk across that portfolio. So gaining that first level of understanding of what are the environmental aspects associated with all of our activities, and what level of control do we need to make sure that we comply with the law and we deliver continuous improvement across that very wide portfolio. It's not unusual for us to be turning up at a particular site, pulling out some little kit gadget or what have you and say, what's the environmental risk here? So having that wide view of the whole organisation allows you to focus in on the things that are important.
Brilliant, thank you. And our second question is, can audits be undertaken remotely? Which I believe is a question for Laurie.
Yeah, happy to respond to that. So obviously, COVID was a shock to everybody, and it made BSI look at our approach for audit delivery along with all of everybody else involved in certification. So the simple answer is yes, audits can be conducted remotely, but for things like ISO 14000 and 14064, BSI are accredited by UCAS. So they are the policemen that check that we're doing the right thing, and they have quite strict rules regarding whether a remote audit is appropriate or not. So BSI, when we're looking at delivering an audit, and when an organisation asks if the audit could be done fully remotely, we conduct a risk assessment, and we'll have a look at which standard it is that we're auditing and what activities we're due to be auditing. So if on the audit schedule we're down to be looking at the internal audit process and documentation and records and sort of documented communication, those are all things that are well suited to being audited remotely. So UCAS are generally happy with that. But if we were doing an ISO 14000 audit and we were looking at a waste management facility or a chemical facility, something like that, something with high environmental risk, it's more appropriate that we spend at least part of the audit actually on site and conducting an effective site tour. It's something that we're always looking at because technology is improving. There are other parts of BSI where we're looking at using drones to conduct some sort of certain audits. When we're looking at forestry and plantations and things, it's a lot more efficient to use a drone to go and have a look at the impact of the trees and the tree cropping rather than having somebody on the ground walking around. So yes, remote audits are possible, but it depends on the risk of the activities that are due to be audited on that day.
Brilliant, thank you. It's a very comprehensive answer. We have quite a juicy question now, which I'd like to open up to probably all of our speakers, which is, are there any quick wins on how a local authority might improve current environmental management practices? Would anybody like to go first?
Well, I'll jump in, April, but I think from local authorities that I have worked with in the past, anything that can improve energy efficiency and reduce waste is a quick win. It's a quick win financially, but it's also something that lots of organisations are now reporting. So they will be reporting recycling rates, things like that. So anything that you can do to encourage or increase recycling, better waste segregation. It's a sort of a good news story, but also financially can have significant benefits as well. I think that's probably the quickest win from my experience.
Brilliant, thank you. And our final question for today is, how long does it take to implement a standard or management system?
Shall I answer that?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, I wasn't there in the early days of Warwickshire implementing 14,001, but I have been in the private sector doing it. And it's a fair task to start if you've got absolutely nothing. But what you tend to find is that most organisations have lots of little bits already in place. So it's just a question of pulling them all together to making sure that you're being very methodical in terms of looking at what the standard is requiring and making sure that you can put a big tick against each of those key requirements. And to go through that process for a typical organisation, you're looking at around about 6 months worth of effort to get to the point where you have a shell of an environmental management system. And it's very useful at that point to bring in who you'll be working for certification and get them to have a little look at it, do a gap analysis to make sure that you've ticked all the right boxes. Obviously, it does depend on the complexity of the organisation, and I wasn't around in 2006 when it was first done for Warwickshire County Council, but I think that 6 months would be a good benchmark. I don't know what the auditors themselves have to say on that.
Yeah, from my experience, sort of 6 to 12 months is a typical implementation period. What some organisations, particularly local authorities or organisations with lots of sort of diverse different activities and different departments, is organisations can sort of start small and say, okay, our biggest environmental risks are associated with the waste collection service. So we're just going to focus on implementing management system to address that and get that certified. And then over time, as the system develops, you can add in more and more departments and functions. And that's a sort of a progressive approach to rolling out the management system. From a purely a technical point of view, when we go in to do an initial assessment, we need to see evidence that the management system has been effectively implemented for a minimum of 3 months. But in most organisations will have been up and running for certainly 6 months and often longer than that.
Brilliant, thank you all. So that is all we have time for today. I would like to thank Vicky, Laurie, Steve and Andrew for sharing some fantastic insights into such an important topic. As mentioned, you will receive a copy of today's recording as an on-demand webinar, which includes links to our handout documents. Thank you once again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.